The house. For years since I moved into the house where both my grandparents and aunt lived and died, strange electrical things would happen, with lights flickering and the kitchen timer going off, and just as I was about to write them off, I had a baby, and more strange things happened. The Elmo toy vacuum would go off with no pets near it, and as I'm typing this, the new potty that does a song when you close the lid just went off. I'm used to it by now. I was asleep and a soap came off a dry dish, and I swore a small jewelry box fell off the dresser. When my daughter played with her toy hammer, the handle of the credenza moved and clicked. Most of these things I disregarded, but in the last month, right after my aunt's picture fell off the library shelf, my babysitter told me on 2 separate Thursdays that the TV went on upstairs around noon. The second time, she asked Oliver the cat to come down and it turned off. After that first incident, 2 days later, on Saturday at 2:30 a.m., the TV came back on. I turned it off using the remote and went back to sleep. It has since happened 4 more times, always at the same time, 2:30, and either Thursday, Saturday, or Sunday, and always Channel 5, even though I had watched and turned it off while on different channels. This seems unbelievable. I know. Oh, I forgot the big part. The last 2 times I asked whoever had turned it on to turn it off, and it did. I noticed that the shows coming on were my aunt's favorites, Oprah and Matlock, as she did not have cable. I'm somewhat afraid to be alone, but knowing it is family and not an evil entity calms me down. I think I'm more freaked out now knowing I can communicate with my dead aunt by shouting at my television. Oscar. A few years ago, on October 15th, I and 2 friends drove to Boise, Idaho so I could have open-heart surgery. Specifically, my arteries were 90% clogged, and I needed to have 4 bypasses done. When we arrived in Boise, we found a motel and checked in. My mother and brother were due to arrive in Boise at some point, but we didn't know quite when, so we took our bags to the room. We had been there for less than 20 minutes when the phone rang and my care provider answered it. As she listened, a funny look came over her face, and she said the phone was for me. Now, we had chosen the motel at random, and I hadn't told anyone where it was yet, so there was no way anyone could have known where we were, but I took the phone anyways. At the other end of the line was a male, Latino-sounding voice, and they again asked for me. When I confirmed who it was, the voice said, "Don't have your surgery tomorrow. It's not your turn to die." I was floored, but managed to ask, "Who is this?" The voice replied, "Oscar." The only person I've ever known by that name was a former coworker of mine. We worked together at the factory, and he would always stop by to chat when he was on shift. That Oscar had died of cancer the year before. "Where are you at?" I asked the voice. "I am in between heaven and earth," it responded. Then it again told me not to have my surgery, and the connection went dead. Immediately, I called my brother, who had also worked with Oscar, and he thought I should take the call seriously. We discussed it over dinner that night and decided we should raise my concerns with a doctor, but in a roundabout way, so he wouldn't know why I was concerned in the first place. The next morning, we went to the hospital just before we were due at 6 a.m., and they started prepping me for surgery. I asked to see my doctor and was told he would be there in a few minutes. A few minutes later, I looked through my door and could see him pacing in tight circles just outside. Finally, he came in and said my surgery would be postponed by a week, and that the department head would be in to explain everything. According to the department head, who arrived shortly thereafter, the surgeon who had been scheduled to perform my surgery had lost his last 3 patients, and they had decided to pull him from the roster. The department head said he would be performing my surgery himself the following week and apologized for the inconvenience. A week later, my surgery was performed without any complications, and I have been healthy since. I don't know how, but Oscar had been looking out for me. It's not Grandma. As you may know, when a relative dies and they have no will, their possessions are divided equally amongst the family. My grandmother died of cancer when I was 2 years old. I don't remember much of the time we spent together, but from what I heard, she had a short and troubled life. My grandmother was succeeded by 9 children, including my mother. Her assets were sorted through and given away. My mother had cared for my grandmother during her illness, and I think the strain of also having to take on her possessions kept her from accepting most of them at the time. When I was 6, my aunt asked my mom if she was ready to take some of the things my grandmother had left behind, and my mother finally accepted. My sister and I were ecstatic. What little kid doesn't love having stuff to rummage through? and when the things arrived, my mother let us pick one thing each to keep. One thing in particular caught my eye, an old light blue telephone that my aunt had told me I used to play with at my grandmother's house. I had to have it. Once my mother said it was okay, I took the phone to my room and played with it all day long. The rest of the day and night passed as it usually did. Dinner, bath time, and bed, all in short order. I still shared a room with one of my sisters then, Kara, and at bedtime we jumped at our bunk beds and began to relax. The phone was sat on my playstand, where it had spent the whole day, along with some other toys. I had finally fallen asleep when a loud, bleating noise pierced my ears, and I woke with a start. Kara woke up too, and she didn't seem all that worried when, still partially asleep, she began to look for the source of the noise. It turns out my new playphone was ringing. Remember, this phone had no cord, and even if it had, we didn't have a phone jack in our room. I guess it did register to Kara that the phone was fake, because she picked up the receiver and said hello. A moment later, she dropped the phone, screamed for my mother, and ran to hold me in the bunk. The voice on the phone kept speaking, and now I could hear it. The voice on the other end was my grandmother's, but it wasn't her demeanor. The voice was ill-tempered and seemed violent. All it kept repeating was,
"Hello, girls."
And,
"I'm here, girls."
with a horrible laugh in between. It kept up the laughing even after my mother bolted through the door. She took one look at the situation and immediately hung up the phone. She tried her best to calm us. By this time, everyone in the house was awake and in our room asking what had happened. All we could say was, "Grandma's here," to which my mother replied, "That was not your grandma." Needless to say, the next day my toy was destroyed, and I'm not sure to this day if it was her or not.